Started. So welcome to today's session. It will be recorded for anyone who wants to reference this later. You can visit the Career Center YouTube channel. This will be the first series of our interview workshop series this week. And I will share the link in our chat in case you want to join additional sessions. But we're very excited to have Pam Skillings joining us this afternoon. She is the co-founder of Big Interview and is the expert for all things interviewing. So we're very excited to have you here today, Pam. So I will have her take it away. We will reserve the last 15 minutes or so for questions. So feel free to type in the Q&A section. Be sure to do that if there's anything that comes up, but I'll pass it to you, Pam. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here with all of you today to talk about my favorite subject, interviewing, job interviews, and give you all some techniques and some advice to help you. I know probably many of you are out there already interviewing. Some of you might be planning to start soon. And so we've got lots of advice and tips to help you be as successful as you possibly can out there once you start going out on those job interviews. So I'm going to share my screen, my presentation, and dive right in because we have a lot to cover. I was mentioning to Stephanie and Sarah that my typical approach to these, we only have an hour. There's only so much to cover. Believe it or not, I can talk and have talked for hours on this subject in the past. But we have an hour, and I want to fit in as much as I can, give you as much useful information as I can, but at the same time, really focus on the things that I think are going to be the most useful to the most people. So that's the goal of the presentation as I've structured it. And of course, leaving time for your questions, for all of you to be able to ask questions and get advice on the situations that you're facing right now. Everybody has a different level of experience. Everybody's pursuing different types of roles and facing different challenges. So I want to make sure that we do have time to answer individual questions, do a little group coaching here as best we can as well. So feel free, as Stephanie said, if you do have questions that come up as we go through the different topics we're covering today, go ahead and post. She said she would be kind enough to take a look and keep on top of those so that we can make sure, especially those that are themes that a lot of people are curious about, so that we can address those when the time comes. I'm going to cover a few topics today, and the way I'm going to do it is this is about me first. I'll cover a few best practices, and then I'll dive into a couple of specific topics. And after each of those, I will pause to give an opportunity to address questions on that topic and related things, because we'll be in the moment, we'll all be thinking about it. So I find that can be really helpful to pause periodically through the presentation to focus on questions on that topic. And then we will also leave some time at the end to cover questions on anything else or things that didn't occur to you in that moment. So we will we'll have plenty of time for questions over the course of the next hour. I'm going to try to speak quickly to make sure we get through everything that we want to get through. So this is me. Some of you have used Big Interview. You may have seen me, as you see in the top image there. I'm your friendly neighborhood virtual practice interview person in some of the interview sets that you'll find on Big Interview. So basically, Big Interview is a platform, job interview training platform. I'm the co-founder based on my experience as a career coach. We've been around for a long time now. We have more than 600 different schools and universities, including USC, that use Big Interview. We have a lot of different tools on there. We have lessons and training. We also have the practice interview tool, answer builders. I'll talk about some of those things as we go along. And like I said, this grew out of my experience as a career coach. I've spent about 15 years coaching. Prior to that, I worked in the corporate world in HR and training and communications. So this is something that I'm very passionate about, this idea of leveling the playing field for everyone to know how to interview well, and not just people who happen to be connected or have the right mentors or have access to the right information at the right time. I really do believe that interviewing is a life skill. It's going to serve you throughout your career. I think everybody should have access to these techniques to present themselves in the best possible way. So this is what I do day in and day out between Big Interview and my coaching. And I'm currently working on a book, the Job Interviews for Dummies, which will be coming out. So this is something that I'm basically a complete nerd about. So hopefully I'll be able to answer any and all questions that come up on this subject. As I said, I wanted to be selective about what we cover. We have limited time. So I am going to talk a little bit about best practices, how to ace any interview, as I say here in the first bullet. And then I really want to talk about some of the most common questions. And specifically, these are questions that a lot of people struggle with, or they may not know they struggle with it, but they're not answering them to the best of their possibility. So I want to give some techniques on each of these because I think it'll help pretty much anyone become a better interviewer pretty quickly. So the first of those is the tell me about yourself. We'll get into all about each of these when we get to that section. And then I want to talk about behavioral interviews. So these are the tell me about a time questions. Tell me about a time you worked on a team. Tell me about a time you worked with a difficult coworker. All of those good ones that are very common out there. And then I want to talk about strengths and weaknesses, another very common topic that comes up that can be a little bit challenging for some of us to talk about, especially in an interview environment, which, as we all know, is a little bit more nerve-wracking, a little bit more pressure than the typical conversation. Okay, so briefly talking about best practices here, the first thing I want to mention, and there's a million best practices, I had to narrow it to a few things I just wanted to be able to address at the beginning because they're going to apply to all the questions we talk about and any others that you might be wondering about or preparing for. So the first one is this idea of interview mode. You know, I think about it almost like a video game where you're going into interview mode. It's not false. It's not trying to be someone that you're not. It's a different version of you. And you have to be a little bit different in an interview than in your typical conversation. Most of us are not used to going around talking about ourselves in this way. You have a limited amount of time in an interview. You have to be able to sell yourself a little bit. And it's different for a lot of us, and it's uncomfortable for a lot of us. So a lot of the stuff I'm talking about today will allow you to just get comfortable shifting into that slightly more refined and promotional version of yourself. If you think about it that way, it can be helpful in terms of trying to change your personality or be someone that you're not. It's not that at all. It's sort of a channeling a different aspect of yourself. And part of that really is confidence. And I know how hard it can be to project confidence in this type of situation. It's nerve-wracking. People are asking weird questions. Some of them are unfriendly. Some of them are trying to be intimidating. So some of the things we talk about here is preparing your answers so that even if you are feeling nervous, even if you are thrown off your game in the moment, you'll still be able to project that confidence. You'll still have good answers. Skipping ahead to the last one, prep and practice are game changing. And this is part of it. All right. So if you prep and you practice before you go into the interviews, it's not going to be as easy to throw you off or to stump you. Being concise, I like to mention this at the top because this is something that a lot of us struggle with, which is trying to keep each answer in the 1 to 2 minute range. Now, of course, there's not going to be a buzzer that goes off at 2 minutes. You know, it's just sort of a rule of thumb because people's attention spans are short. Any more than about 2 minutes of someone monologuing, even if it's good content, you're going to start to lose people. So you really want to aim in that 1 to 2 minutes. Of course, don't keep talking. If you don't have anything to say, it doesn't have to be a certain length. But ideally, that 1 minute, you know, if you're not using at least 1 minute, you're probably leaving something out that could be impressive. So you want to make sure that your answers have substance as well, being concise, but also making sure that you're telling them all the things you want them to know about you. Showing your interest, this is key. And this is something I think that especially people coming out of school or who are students and haven't done a lot of this interviewing forget about at times, which is this idea of showing them, hey, I'm interested. I want this job. People say, well, I'm here. Obviously, I applied. I'm interested, which is fine, right? But at the same time, when they're talking to a lot of people who all have good qualifications, sometimes that interest, that passion, that motivation, okay, sometimes it's hard to be passionate about an entry-level job, but interest, enthusiasm can be that edge in terms of choosing who gets the offer. So that's something to keep in mind, especially when you're answering questions like why this role, why do you want to work for this company, etc. And then just repeating that last one because it's one of my mantras, which is prep and practice are a game changing. And I know everyone would agree and say, yes, you should practice. It will be helpful. I agree, but you don't do it. It's awkward. It's sometimes it's hard to recruit someone to practice with you, or you're not quite sure what to practice or how to practice or what to ask the other person after you practice. So it can feel strange. But it's worth it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the prep piece of it, how to outline bullet points for some of these key questions, and a little bit about practice as well. And some of you have used the Big Interview practice tool. The whole Big Interview platform basically came out of this challenge that my clients were not practicing. They knew they should, they wanted to. So creating an online tool was really helpful for getting people to do it. Some of them still resist, but once you're a convert, you will see the difference. So those are some of the best practices I wanted to cover here right out of the gate before getting into some specific questions. Some of these common questions that are going to come up that you should all be prepared for. Okay, so I'm not going to pause for questions here because I want to make sure we get some momentum going. I'm going to dive right into the next one, which is tell me about yourself. And just as a heads up, after I talk about tell me about yourself, I will pause and take questions on this and other topics, and then move on to our next one. So the tell me about yourself, many of you have heard this, many of you have had this if you've been out there interviewing. It's still probably the most common first question, and there are different variations. I'll show you a couple other variations on this one as well. Maybe one of the most common is walk me through your resume, right? So it's this big open-ended question, first one in most interviews, because a lot of these interviewers are not well trained. They do not know what they're doing. They're just doing what they've seen other people do, right? Or they read a quick article. So a lot of them, it's a lazy way to start things off, to ask you. It's basically putting all the pressure on you to tell them what they need to know. So it's a little bit daunting. That's why they ask it. It can be an opportunity. If you approach it the right way, it can be an opportunity because it gives you the chance to start strong. So how do you do that? Here's those variations. Tell me a bit about your background. These are all things that come up that are similar. And just to briefly say, the answer that you create based on this 3-part model I'm going to share with you for tell me about yourself, you can use that answer for any of these as well. Right? So just because they say walk me through your resume doesn't mean you have to walk through everything on your resume starting at the beginning. It's still basically saying, hey, what's your deal? Who are you? What's your story? What's your career narrative? So you can use the same answer for all of these. Hey, what are the common mistakes? I don't know if any of you will confess to having made any of these mistakes in the past. I see it all the time. The first one's probably the most common, the breathless resume monologue, just minutes upon minutes of basically restating the entire resume, often starting at the very beginning, getting into a lot of irrelevant information, taking forever to get to the most relevant information. Yeah, so this is what I see the most. And it makes sense, right? Logically speaking, you're thinking, okay, well, tell me about yourself. I'll start at the beginning. You start at the beginning, tell the linear story of who I am, right? And so, yes, and sometimes that works, especially if you're a student or you're a new grad, you haven't been out there working for 20 years, there's not as much to talk about. So sometimes you can take a slightly linear approach and cover most of the key aspects of your background, but you still do want to be focused and concise there. First date approach and story of your life, they're kind of similar, right? Being too personal, too much like a blind date, too much like, hey, I'm from Chicago, I love basketball. You can sneak in some of that. They do want to get to know you. They are trying to figure out if you're someone that they want to work with, but the focus really should be on the professional side. So you want to make sure that you're getting in all that good stuff about your professional qualifications. The idea of it is that it is an elevator pitch. Some of you are familiar with the concept of an elevator pitch from the world of marketing, this idea that it's a short summary of the benefit you would bring if hired, right? Like you might pitch your business in an elevator ride. If you happen to get in the same elevator with some venture capitalists or investors, you're going to pitch them on why they should invest in you. Same deal here, except you're pitching yourself as a hire. Why should they invest in you? What makes you stand out? Why are you qualified, right? Really trying to grab their attention from the beginning. And thinking about it as a highlight reel, right? You may have done a lot of interesting things in your life, but thinking about what are the things I want to immediately establish with these people who are hiring for this job. And I think one of the good things about being a student or a recent graduate is there are fewer things to choose from when figuring out your highlight reel, just because you haven't been in the work world as long as maybe some others. So it's a little bit easier to be focused earlier in your career. It does get more challenging as you go. Overall, you want this whole answer to be under 2 minutes. Like I said, 1 to 2 minute range. This one is one of the ones that's hard to do that with, because if you're telling the whole story of your life, and as you'll see, I'm suggesting that you cover several things over the course of this answer. So it can be challenging to keep it under 2 minutes, which is why we try to prep and practice to make sure that we're staying focused. And of course, professional is the key here. We do want to show a little bit of personality, especially early in your career. And I am trying to customize all of this for this audience of students and soon-to-be grads and recent grads. When you're hiring someone who doesn't have a ton of work experience yet, it is much more of a focus on potential and is this person coachable? Does this person have the raw sort of talent and intelligence and other things that would make them good in this career path? So it is fine to show a little bit of your personality, share a few details about your life and who you are, what you care about, but make sure that you're also focusing on the professional and that that's more of the weight of the answer. So how do we do that? We use the 3-part model. So this is a 3-part model that I use with all of my coaching clients. If you've been on Big Interview and you've gone to the lessons on Tell Me About Yourself, you've heard about it. It's very simple. It's not the only way to do it. It's not like interviewers even know that this model exists, so they're not checking off that you've hit all the 3 parts. But to me, and all of my clients over the years, is just an easy way to organize what can be a lot of information and create a sort of a story arc, a little bit of structure around your career story. So the idea here, who you are, why you're qualified, and why you're here. So let's get into each of those. Part 1 is who you are. So starting off with a little bit of a high-level overview of who you are professionally, right? So this is in contrast to the idea of starting at the very beginning of your story, the linear approach, and saying, I was born in this town, I have 3 brothers, starting at the very beginning. The high-level overview of who you are professionally immediately establishes that credibility, right? Because you're talking about your career specialization. For students and recent grads, this is often about your education, right? So this is often about, hey, I'm a senior studying business at USC, focused on XYZ specialization. So it's really establishing, I've been studying in this area, this is something I'm interested in, I have these academic accomplishments, and it's a good way of immediately establishing credibility, much like your resume at this stage in your career starts with education, right? Showing, hey, this is who I am, this is my educational background. Okay, and then you might, we'll talk more about where you might go from here. We'll look at some examples here. We've got a student example. See, very simple. This can be very simple. It gets more complicated as you advance in your career, right? So the second one is someone with a very diverse background in HR, kind of giving like a summary, immediately establishing, I'm this experienced HR person, and I've done all these things that we are assuming are related to the job that they're applying for here. Sometimes if you happen to have worked for very prestigious companies and organizations, the third one is an example of immediately establishing credibility with something like that. So just a couple of examples of ways to establish that who I am overview, right? Experienced candidates might use something like, I have more than 10 years of experience managing operations for high-tech software company, so something along those lines, sort of establishing your level and specialization within your career right out of the gate. So that's part one. A couple bad examples. I won't dwell on these, as I told you. TMI, lots of TMI in this one, right? Don't need to talk in detail about your early education and childhood. You don't want to use a sort of generic blah, I'm looking for a job because ways of starting out. So some things to avoid. Okay, so that's part one, who I am. Now let's talk part two, why I'm qualified. This is the traditional sort of overview of your career so far, right? So you've established a big picture. Now you're going to cover like 3 or 4 sort of things that you want to immediately highlight to establish, who you are. So for you, most likely, this is going to be focused on academic achievements, internships, extracurriculars. Some of you have had jobs, part-time, full-time jobs that you've done, consulting, projects associated with your schooling or with your extracurriculars. So a lot of those are the things you're going to highlight in this middle section of why you're qualified. It's a good place to mention some of your areas of expertise, some of your key skills and competencies, maybe additional training, things like studying abroad or winning an award. Remember, you don't have to cover everything here, right? But you do want to think about what are the things that are going to be most relevant to establish who I am and what I've done so far in my career. And the key is you are going to provide more details later. This isn't all you get. But in a way, these are the things that you're planting the seeds here. These are the things they're likely to ask for more info about later. These are the things they're likely to remember. They're immediately forming that impression of who you are. So you do want to lead with some of these most impressive and relevant things for this job. Right. So again, the reminder, keeping the whole thing under 2 minutes. This is the one that can get long. Right. So thinking about how to keep it focused as best you can. Okay, and this is just an example of one element, right? This one might not be the whole middle section, but this is a little bit like, so for example, this is someone who's an experienced professional. They spent 6 years in a particular role, and this is kind of a summary of this experience. Most likely they would also have in that middle section, maybe the job before this one, then maybe there's a little bit of an overview of their certification in certain areas, right? So this is one little area that they're highlighting. So what did they do? What was this job? Mentioning the company, mentioning highlights here, these awards, getting promoted, a little bit about what they love about the job and what they're good at. So this is a nice example of a little nugget that might be in that middle section, the why I'm qualified, the expertise highlights. Okay, and I know I'm running through all this, but I want to get to all 3 parts and an example so that I can field questions. I know we often have questions on this one because it can be daunting. So part 3 is why are you here? So this is one that a lot of people don't think to include. This is the idea here is that you end this tell me about yourself, this overview of who you are and what you're all about, with a brief statement of your interest in the position you're interviewing for, right? So wrapping up at the end, you've walked through your background, you say, I'm really excited to be here because I feel like this role is a great fit for me. It could be as simple as that, right? The idea is that you're ending the answer with a clear expression of interest in the role. And I think that is one thing that can hurt people is that it's not coming across clearly enough, the sincere interest in the role. So it can help to show more enthusiasm and interest. It's a good way to have a nice, crisp, focused, purposeful ending, because otherwise a lot of times people end up wandering off into the weeds like, okay, anything else that you want to know? Or is that they don't know how to end it, right? And on a similar note, if you do get caught up on a tangent and you're wandering off and you're like, oh no, how do I get back on track? Knowing that you have this part 3 to come back to wrap things up can be helpful, because if you're off there rambling, you can say, okay, let's bring it back. Let me wrap this up with my lovely part 3 here, right? It's pretty short. And again, almost always you're going to get a follow-up question at some point. Why are you interested in this role? Why are you interested in this opportunity? So you don't have to go into full detail here. You can keep it pretty short in the tell me about yourself. And here's a couple of examples of of ways to do it. One for a new or soon to be grad that really is much more focused on why the role plays to its strengths and what they like about the company. And for the employed professional, this is also a place where you could briefly address why you're looking for something new now in certain cases. Right, and then a couple bad examples. Don't be too negative. Don't act like you're fleeing something as opposed to moving towards something. Don't make it seem like you're desperate for anything versus interested in this role. So a couple things to avoid there. Right, then we put it all together into a seamless answer. I'm a big believer, if you've looked at anything on Big Interview, for these types of questions, something like the tell me about yourself, the behavioral stories, anything else that's a bit complicated or potentially difficult or could easily go off on tangents, I really do believe in outlining some bullet points, right? The 3 parts makes it easy just to have a couple of bullet points under each. And I'm not a fan of scripting things word for word, but more so bulleting out. It's like an outline of the things you want to cover. And then it's probably going to come out a little bit different each time. So it will still feel authentic, but you'll still be hitting all the things that you definitely want to hit, right? And then practice is the component there too, because once you have the bullet points, the first time you practice out loud, it's going to be awkward. You'll trip. You know, you might adjust some things. You might find you're too long, whatever. But the first time you practice, it's like the rough draft out loud. And then, you know, practice at least another time. And the more you practice, honestly, within reason, the more comfortable you'll feel doing this. And the easier it'll be to remember, the easier it'll be to feel natural, the easier it'll be to do things like have the right body language, because you're not so focused on, oh my God, what am I going to say to this question, right? You'll be able to walk into interviews knowing that you have a great answer for the first question and feeling good about it. So this one in particular, really doing the prep for it can be a huge help across the board for the whole interview. So let me pause there briefly and briefly just see, does anyone have burning questions on anything that we've covered so far before we move on to the next topic? I think, Stephanie, I'll let you.
Yes, I have a few people with their hands raised.
Okay.
We'll start with Erin. You should be able to.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you both so much for this opportunity. My question is just to clarify that it says the elevator pitch to keep under 2 minutes, and then that in the 3-part model, when we're talking about our highlights, it says there to keep total answer concise 2 minutes or under. So my question is, the standard seems to be 2 minutes and just fitting everything, the 3-part model within those 2 minutes.
Yes, correct. And that part 2 being part of it, that was just sort of a reminder in the description of part 2 that the whole thing should be under 2 minutes, not just part 2 on its own.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, you know, that can be a little bit challenging to do. And I have had plenty of clients and people I've worked with who've gone a little bit longer if they have a lot to say. Sometimes it's not hard and fast rule, but just something to aim for.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, we have a question from Erica.
Hi, Erica.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so my question was about showing enthusiasm. So I was wondering what tips you might have for how to demonstrate enthusiasm without potentially being overwhelming or like seeming like desperate or emotional, because I think that's one thing that I might have troubles with, is just getting to like, I really, really, really want it, and like that could just seem like really off-putting.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, on the one hand, I think if it's sincere and if you're able to express that the enthusiasm is really about this role and this position, I think that the downside is limited, right? Even if you might come across a little awkward or a little bit overly, you know, excited, I think it can still be a net positive. I think if it feels too much like, I just want a job, and believe me, I empathize with that. It's a tough market right now and people want to be hired, and sometimes it can come across as come on, just hire me already. I'm good. I'm good. I'm good. Right. So I think being careful to avoid that part of it. But I think bulleting it out a little bit. And sometimes if you feel like there's an aspect of an answer that you struggle with, whether you feel like you can sometimes seem overly, enthusiastic, or in some cases we have people who maybe have a gap or something they have to talk about and they know that's going to be awkward. Sometimes scripting it a little bit, or at least coming up with a couple of words or like phrases that you can use so that you can find a way to describe it in the right sort of mid-tone, right? Like, so not too over the top, but being able to, okay, I'm going to describe it this way. I'm really excited about this because of, the fact that I love, your mission statement, or I feel like your products are fantastic, and just sort of thinking a little bit about the words that you'll use so that it doesn't come out in a rush and come across as overly emotional.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll try to get to more at the end. This is a good one. In the Q&A, what if you have no job experience? Would that hurt you in the interview process, or how would you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I think but it's a common thing, right? So everybody starts somewhere. So there are a lot of people coming out of school that have very limited experience and maybe no job experience, maybe just some internships, volunteer work, things like that. So I think it is beneficial to get creative and really think about what can you talk about that has a bearing on your professional potential and capabilities, even if you don't have formal job experience. So being able to maybe expand on and come up with some good examples from extracurricular activities, school projects. If you find that you don't have enough of that kind of stuff, thinking about, okay, what could I do to get out there and maybe do a certification, or maybe volunteer somewhere where I can use some skills that would be relevant to my future career to give me a little bit more substance to talk about. Because they're not expecting you have done this job before if you're coming into it for an entry level. I mean, obviously there are some people who are delusional that are out there interviewing for these roles too. But most of the time they know that you're coming out of school, you don't have a ton of formal work experience. So they're looking at potential. They're looking at what have you done that show me that you would be reliable, that you would have potential to be good at this job, that you would be easy to work with. So finding things through non-job experience that you can talk about in that way can help with that. And when we talk about behavioral questions next, that those stories can help. If you have some stories about what you did when you worked on the school magazine, or when you helped organize the fundraising drive, ways that you can talk about that show the relevancy to future professional experience.
Great, thank you, Pam. I think we'll leave the rest at another break, or at the end, if you want to continue.
Great. Yeah, so we'll make sure to leave time for questions. So I'm going to cover behavioral questions next, and I'll try to move through somewhat quickly, and then we'll see what we have time left for in terms of strengths and weaknesses. I can certainly point you to where to find more information about that if we run out of time for any of those, or any of the questions that you have. So let's talk about behavioral questions. Right, so these are those questions that start with, tell me about a time, give me an example, right? So they're asking for experiences from your past to give them a sense of what you're like to work with, how do you approach work, what do you value, what's your work style, what's your communication style, have you been exposed to some of the things that you would need to be able to do in this job, right? So they tend to be very focused on aspects of experience that are important in the job that they're hiring for. And then of course there are some very common ones. You've probably all heard the teamwork behavioral question. That's probably the most common for people who are interviewing for internships or entry-level jobs. Get a sense of what you're like to work with on a team, and how you are with people. There's some common ones that come up that are pretty relevant for most jobs. We'll talk about some of those. But the key here is they're asking for an example. You're going to have to tell a story, or you should tell a story, I'll say, because telling a story is the best way to really make an impression when answering this kind of question. The way not to do it is what I see a lot with clients who are not prepared, which is if you go in and someone says, tell me about a time you worked on the team. And you immediately say, oh, I do that all the time. I'm really good at it. I'm a team player. Yeah, totally. Right? That's not an example. That doesn't give me any evidence or sense of who you are or what kind of team experiences you've had. Having an example, a real example, is the best way to kind of give them some insight into who you are and what you're all about and what you could do for them, right? So stories. And one of the reasons that they ask these questions a lot, of course, interviews are imperfect, but based on studies that have been done, these behavioral questions tend to be rated as the most effective way to get real information out of people, to get a real sense of what people have done and what they're capable of. So part of that, I think, is because it's harder to come up with a story on the spot out of nothing, to make it up and BS, the question. If I ask you, how do you define leadership? You could go off on a thing about somebody who read an article and have no real experience. But if I ask you about a time when you took a leadership role, you've got to come up with a story. It's a lot harder to fake that, especially if the interviewer is good and knows how to follow up. So that's their perspective, right? From your perspective, telling a story is a great way to be more memorable. As I'm sure you know, you remember stories you're much more likely to remember something told in a story than just a list of data points, right? This is just human nature. For a long time in human history, stories engage the right brain. You start imagining you in action, picturing you being part of the story. You just become more invested in someone when they tell a story, especially if they're a good storyteller. You don't have to be the greatest storyteller on earth to do this well. In interviews, though, I promise, you can use something called the STAR approach. This is a handy dandy little model. It originally came out of management consulting, and nice little typo in that first bullet point. But the key here is that it's a way to outline a nice story that covers the key aspects you want to communicate using a simple model, right? So STAR stands for situation, task, approach, and then results. So I'm going to talk about this. I think situation and task, I kind of lump together, and I don't take it as technically as maybe some people do. It doesn't always have to be a single situation or a single task. It's really a little bit of the context, a little bit of the backstory, the setup, right? We'll talk about that in a moment. I also wanted to mention here, we do have these nice answer builders in Big Interview. We have Answer Builder for tell me about yourself and other questions too, but the most popular one is for these behavioral questions. So I'm going to talk about how to outline these stories with your bullet points, but you can also go in Big Interview and go to the Answer Builder section, and it'll walk you through writing your bullet points for each section, little tips along the way. So it can be really helpful if you need to go in and outline some new stories and come up with some good examples. Okay, so just a few best practices on this. We want the stories to be recent as they can be. As I said, it's fine for these to be from schoolwork, from community service, extracurricular. If you played on a sports team, a lot of corporate interviewers love athletes. I get it, right? Especially if you were a successful athlete, there's a certain amount of commitment and reliability and persistence that goes into that. So there are a lot of things you can talk about here besides formal work experience, right? These are stories that can come out of different aspects of your life. Again, for each section, we're focusing on the bullet points. We're not writing a script, right? We're focusing on the bullet points that we want to convey in each section. So let's talk about what those sections are. So situation task, as I said, I tend to put these together and not have these as separate things. I think it works better and makes it much more flexible to use for different types of stories. So you're going to briefly describe what this was all about, right? So this was at this particular role. This was a project I worked on as part of my, fraternity organization, whatever it is that you're doing to set it up. Brief. Keep it brief. Resist the temptation to go into too much backstory that's not relevant. You're going to run out of time. These should be in that 2-minute range as well. That can be hard sometimes, but so you don't want to get into too much extraneous information. Be clear in the setup. What were you trying to achieve and why? Why was it important, right? Especially if this is a compelling story because there was a tight deadline, there were a disaster to be averted, there was a big client to win, there was a major grade to achieve, right? That helps to make it a little bit more dramatic, a little bit more interesting to communicate that up front. Then we get into approach. So this is the real content here, walking through what you did. We've set it up. Now these are the actions I took to complete the task, solve the problem, whatever it is that the story is about. As part of this, you should be showing a bit of your thinking and approach, right? It shouldn't, it should be partly showing how you think, and especially anything you did that was particularly impressive, like you came up with an idea, you volunteered to take the lead, you noticed an issue that other people didn't notice, right? You had a special skill that came into play and saved the day, right? Anything like that that you can feature is going to make the story more compelling and interesting. You can mention here whatever skills and competencies that you use, right? So say, this is a good place just to mention, I'm a Python expert because I had to work in Python on this project, or I'm a great negotiator because part of this was negotiating the best possible deal. So throwing those in there, especially those things that are relevant to the job you're interviewing for. This is one to be aware of, being clear about your specific role. And this is especially if you did something above and beyond, if you played a leadership role or if you took on, a major aspect. Talk about it, make that clear. A lot of people just say we about the whole thing. You do want to say we, you do want to show that there was a team involved if there was one, right? But it's also good to take credit for what you did individually. They want to hire you, not the rest of the team, right? So make sure that it's clear what your role was, right? Trying to stay focused on those key details. This is probably going to take the most work and thinking as you're kind of going through those bullet points. You're probably in the first draft going to write down some stuff that you're going to delete because you're going to realize, oh, they don't need to know that, or that's repetitive. Really thinking about what you want to say in this section of the story to really highlight that competency that you're talking about. And then we have part 3. All good stories have a good happy ending. You want to make sure that you're ending with positive outcome, right? So this might be tangible results. Not everybody, not every project ends with a tangible result, like we won the client, I got promoted, I saved the company $1 million, right? Those are all great. If you did it, definitely mention that. But most projects don't necessarily have such a dramatic ending, or you might not know about it, right? It was an internship. You worked on the project, it went well, but then you left. You don't know how much money was saved or where things went after a certain point, right? So in those cases, you can also give anecdotal results. So any kind of feedback that you receive, my manager loved it, my colleagues told me how great it was, my professor gave me the best grade in the class, any kind of positive feedback. And then lessons learned or skills gained, right? Here's where you can say, I learned a lot about dealing with difficult people through this experience, and I was able to really hone my communication skills. This is another nice aspect of results that you can mention in the wrap up of your story. Right, so that's the STAR, the STAR that goes into every story. So how do you use this, right? What do you do with all this, right? So my recommendation typically is that everybody who's going out and interviewing should have a set of what I call your greatest hits stories, right? So thinking about the projects you've worked on or the experiences you've had that are particularly impressive and or relevant to the types of jobs you're looking for, right? So starting with those, as opposed to starting with going online and researching what are the most common behavioral questions and trying to come up with a story for each of those. That's a lot, right? And what happens is if you have these top projects that you've worked on and early in your career, you're going to have a few that kind of stand out. Each of those tends to be have relevance in different ways, right? So if I'm telling a story about my group project, it might touch on teamwork, it might touch on presentation skills, it might touch on data analysis, right? So you can use the same story for different types of questions if it's a good one, right? If it's one that you really want to highlight. And then of course you do want to think about, based on the job description and the type of position and what are the most common behavioral questions in general, okay, are there other stories I need to come up with because I don't have one that that touches on this common type of question that I'm likely to be asked, right? So each time that you write a story or come up with a story, you're going to categorize it and sort of write down, okay, this included teamwork and attention to detail and leadership, right? And then you'll have that categorized in your brain. And when someone asks you a weird question, you'll be able to flip through your memory and come up with the best possible story to tell. Right, so here's a little example, and I'm not going to delve into it here, but I just wanted to show in action, and this is a little bit more scripted than you would, I mentioned doing bullet points, right? I've scripted this a little bit just so you can see how it would flow in real life, as a story, right? So you can see a little bit about person who's an assistant account manager, the boss was away, the client called, they're freaking out, they need something right away. And, there was pressure. There's a little bit of setting up. This was an important client. This was an important thing. This was a difficult situation because the boss wasn't there and there was a time limit. And this is the setup. We're already creating some nice conflict, right? And drama. Right? And then we get into sort of the approach. What did we do? And it's interesting, we're showing in this first bullet point the ability to listen, the ability to make the client feel heard and have those people and communication skills, in addition to then moving on in the other bullets to talk about actually solving the problem, figuring it out, taking initiative, going to the right people, being persistent, communicating the importance, being persuasive, and ultimately figuring out what was going on. Leading to the results, and you can see there's some overlap between sections. You could maybe have put this first bullet point in the previous section, but it's part of the results as well. They figured out what to do, they fixed it, and they got great feedback, right? Ray was very excited. He told the CEO, he told this person's boss, lots of good compliments in there. And this is a nice note for those of you who have trouble selling yourself or being self-promotional. Quote other people. If your boss says you're brilliant, if your client said you were great, if your coworker said you were the best writer on the team, quote them if you don't want to say it for yourself, right? So some nice results there for this particular story. Okay, a couple of things to think about. Are you the hero? Was your role clear, right? Is the happy ending there? Keeping it in that 2-minute range. And then I just want to mention practice. With these stories, with these behavioral stories, practice is really important. It will help you remember when the time comes that you have to tell the story. It'll help you feel more confident talking about yourself in this weird self-promotional way. And it will help refine your nonverbal communication, right? Instead of being nervous and worrying about eye contact and all those things, you will have practice. This is not going to be the first time you're talking about yourself in this way. It really is a game changer. And I wouldn't keep harping on it if I hadn't seen it in action so many times, the value of practice. So I'm going to stop there because we have just under 10 minutes left. And I think based on my conversation with Stephanie, we should stop there and spend the rest of the time on questions. Just to let folks know, the last stuff I was going to cover, if time permitted, has to do with strengths and weaknesses. So if you have questions on those are things we can cover, and I can zip ahead to the slides on what's most relevant. But let's open it up to questions in general now, and we can cover questions related to those or any other topics that are on your mind today.
Okay, so we do have lots of questions. One question I had is, how can I better prepare for a job interview after being in the military for 20 years? So sometimes people are pivoting, or, how do you approach that situation?
I'm so glad that you asked that question. And I think it really is, it's a different situation than a lot of people find themselves in. And I encourage you, we do have a playbook on Big Interview for people moving from military into civilian job interviews, because there are a lot of specific things that can be helpful. One of the things I know from working with clients who are leaving the military or who are ex-military is that people tend to be very structured. They want to have some steps to follow. They want to know what to do. And so the playbook attempts to do that. And I think a lot of it has to do with thinking about how to translate what you've done and your successes into language that civilian interviewers will understand, and not assuming that they'll know what you're talking about or know how impressive that thing was that anyone with a military background would automatically know from the way you're describing it, but you may need to translate that to for a civilian audience. I think for a lot of ex-military too, learning to be a little bit self-promotional can be difficult, because that's not the military way to go around saying that you're great in your interactions. So yeah, so I think check out that playbook, because it goes into some really detailed tips on how to do those, and some of the other things that I've noticed can be challenging when you start to interview for non-military jobs after spending most of your career in the military.
Thank you. And a lot of it is also transferable skills, whether it be the military or a completely different industry.
100%. And so many companies and industries want you, and they understand the value, and they understand some of those transferable skills, just being able to make sure that you're speaking the language and making sure that they're hearing that so that you can make that connection.
For some of their students, you know, they could just be starting out. So one question is it okay to talk about your experience at an internship or anything that was in high school? What is your opinion on that?
Yes, talk about your internships for sure. Some internships, look, I get that some internships are not particularly illuminating and you're making copies and you're not doing things that are that exciting from your perspective. But just the fact that you were there, that you sought out an internship, that you gained that experience, that's something. And for most internships, there were some things that you did, some things you worked on that you had exposure to that really are very relevant in showing some of the skills that you would need for a job. So don't be shy in talking about internships like that doesn't count, right? That's part of your experience. I would highlight it. Really think about how to make it sound as impressive as possible. I'm not suggesting that you lie, but I know with your friends, you might be like, yeah, it was so boring. I didn't really do much of anything today. Don't be that way. Don't be the self-deprecating one in the interviews. Focus on saying, yeah, it was a great experience. I worked closely, with senior management. I had an opportunity to work on these types of projects. Yeah, maybe you didn't lead the project. No one expects the intern led the whole project, but just the fact that you were exposed to, the way that the organization operated and some of the different projects, that's saying something that shows that you have some background that's going to be helpful.
So there are actually quite a few questions about strengths and weaknesses. Would you mind just doing a quick rundown? How should you approach the strengths and weakness question?
Yes, let's do a quickie on that. And I don't know if it's cool, Stephanie, for us to go over it at all. I'm happy to stay for a few extra minutes if you want to. And if people want to stay, I know people have stuff to do as well. But let me quickly talk about strengths and weaknesses. Strength, I think, is one of the challenging ones because, let me go back here. A lot of us are worried about weaknesses. We might prep for that and we don't go to the trouble of prepping strengths. We end up using these generic things of, hey, I'm easy to work with and I'm good with people and I'm a hard worker. And those are all good things, but they don't tend to be memorable or exciting enough to stand out sometimes, right? So my whole thing here is, as you're getting ready for interviews, come up with a list. I say start out by coming up with at least 5 strengths that apply to you. And then for each of those strengths, I want you to write a proof point. So proof points can be a sentence or 2-ish, right? That describes how you in particular have shown that strength, right? So let's say your strength is attention to detail. Your proof point might be that this is something that's always been a strength of yours, and this project that you worked on as part of your thesis required extensive attention to detail. So throwing in a little example, or sometimes it's even a more general thing. If reliability is one of your strengths, like I'm always the first one in the morning. I'm someone who goes the extra mile to make sure that I come through for people, right? It could be a little more general as well, but you want to have a proof point, not just a list of strengths, because that's really what's going to stick and impress people. So if you get stuck, ask someone you trust. There's something called the Gallup Strengths Finder, which is, I think it's like $20 or $25 to do. And it can be helpful if you're really struggling with how to articulate your strengths or what you think your greatest strengths are. It's a nice little self-assessment that can be helpful. But you probably have a sense, at least of some of your strengths. It's just a matter of how do I articulate it and how do I sell it, in a way that people are going to believe, yeah, this is definitely a strength, right? Here's an example: strong work ethic. So this is a little bit general at the beginning. When I commit to a deadline, I do whatever it takes. For example, right? So we have a little example here about staying up late, pulling things together, and really showing that work ethic is a strength for this person. So that's an example of a proof point. It was sort of a long proof point. It doesn't have to be this detailed, but you'll probably have time if you follow the 1 to 2 minute rule to cover 3 strengths with any sort of substantial proof point. So I would aim to have your top 3. The reason I tell people to start by coming up with at least 5 is because I know a lot of people are modest. I want to force you to come up with as many as you can, because you'll have your top 3, and then it's useful to have spares because you might end up having an opportunity to talk about some of those others as well. And you might look to customize your top 3 depending on the job. If you're looking at different types of jobs, you might have a top 3 for one career path versus another one. So really take the time with strengths. This is one of the things I find that people neglect, and they just sort of wing it. But I think if you do a little bit of prep, a little bit of bulleting out the descriptions, it's going to make your strengths that much more impressive and memorable. Right? And then the weakness one, I want to touch on this one because it's pretty quick. My way of dealing with weakness. Questions about weakness in general are still pretty common. You're probably going to get it at some point if you're out there widely interviewing. So it's good to be prepared. You want to pick a weakness that is not scary, right? So nothing that could be viewed as a potential deal breaker, nothing that could be viewed as a sign of not being reliable. You don't want to say, I had a client who once said, oh, I have trouble being on time, and I oversleep a lot. No, don't share that. That's not something to be, don't be too candid, right? You want to pick something that's not central to the job that you're interviewing for and not seen as some major thing that can't be fixed. Most of us are on a spectrum with any particular skill, right? Time management, let's say. You might be great at it. Most of us could always be better, right? So thinking about that way, so that you're not presenting this as, this is something I'm terrible at and it's a fatal flaw, but more so, hey, I could be better at this in the following way, right? So picking something, describing it in a neutral way that's not going to raise red flags, right? Don't try to do this thing where you say, I just work too hard. They already know about this one. There's books out there that tell people to say, I'm too much of a perfectionist. I just work too hard. They're going to think you're hiding something. They're not going to believe that. And I know that is a weakness for some people, but if you use it as a weakness, you have to sort of describe why it's a weakness and not just a way to avoid giving a real weakness. And then the key thing here, the magic ingredient, is after you've described the weakness, you talk about how you're already working on improving that weakness, right? So if you talk about one of your weaknesses, here, I have an example, so why try to riff on that, and then move on. Don't add more weaknesses. If they ask for one, if they ask in general, give them one and then keep it moving, right? So here's an example, right? I can be a little bit too honest when I provide feedback, right? So a little bit of description here to show this is not like some extreme thing where I'm mean and cruel to people. It's just, I'm straightforward. A lot of people are cool with that. There are times when I need to be a little bit more gentle. And here's how I've already, looked into improving. I took a class. It's really helped me. I've gotten much better, right? So this is an example of how you might address the weakness and how you're already working on it. So that's sort of strengths and weaknesses in a quickie overview. I'll stop there. If anyone has additional questions on this or other topics.
I know we're running out of time, but I think there's 2 more questions if you don't mind. What if you're asked a question that you're not prepared for? How should you go about that? Can you pause and, how would you go about it?
Great question. I'm glad you asked this because I think I'm a big believer in the pause if you need a pause, right? I think some people feel, and I get that it feels like every second in an interview is just going on forever sometimes, but pausing is fine, right? Especially if it's a tough question or if it's a detailed question, right? Most people need a moment to sort of think about it before they answer a complex question. So in general, it's okay to pause. Don't feel like you have to rush in with the first thing that you want to say, right? If you find that you need a little bit more time than feels, normal, you could ask them to repeat the question. You could say something like, oh, great question, Bob. Let me think about the best example, right? Just to kind of buy yourself a little bit more time there. I think in general, pausing a little bit is, especially if you know that nothing good is going to come out if you just start blurting it right now. So I think that's always a good option, to pause, see what you can come up with. The next thing to think about, let's say you've paused. Sometimes you pause and you just froze, and then you can come up with an answer to the question and you're okay. Other times you realize, I don't have an example of this thing they're asking me for, right? That's an example. So do what you can to translate what is the intent behind the question, right? So if they ask you for an example of a time you disagreed with your manager, right? I cannot think of a single time I didn't disagree with my manager. I don't have an answer. Okay, well, what do they care about? Why are they asking me this question? Oh, it's about, can I be diplomatic? Can I disagree with people in a professional way? Okay, so do what you can to address the intent behind the question. So you could say, I can't think of a time I disagreed with my manager offhand, but I know that on my team, we often have differences in opinion. And so one thing that I tend to do with my teammates, and just sort of addressing what they're looking for with the question. If you know that you're not going to come up with an answer no matter what, let's say it's a technical question and you just don't know, I think honesty is usually the best policy there. What you can do to soften it a little bit is to try to tie it into something that you do know about, or if all else fails, I'm a fast learner, right? So you can say, I'm not really familiar with that particular function in Excel, but I will say I'm a really fast learner. I've gotten up to speed quickly on software. So I'm confident that I'd be able to master that if given the opportunity, right? So those are sort of when you don't know the answer tips.
And then this is a great question. It's common to be told to leave a lasting impression. So when you're up against people with the same or even better qualifications, how can you leave a lasting impression? And someone is also asking, how can you still show your personality as well within the interview?
Yeah, I think a lot of the reason that I harp on prep and practice is because I feel you never know who you're going up against. You might be up against someone who has some impressive, thing that you can't compete with. Everybody coming into this is going to have strengths and weaknesses. So whatever you can do to make your strengths and your qualifications as impressive as possible. And also, on the defense side, being prepared. If hey, I know I'm a little light in this area, being prepared if they happen to ask about that so that you can reframe, right, and handle it. So those are some of the things, really thinking about how to sell yourself better, which I know is hard for a lot of people, is a way to make a memorable impression. Telling these stories for the behavioral examples are ways to make you more memorable, because you're going to share an interesting story. Your sense of humor is likely to come out if you kind of prep a little bit and you feel comfortable telling the story. So I think letting your personality out a bit, it's much more likely, if you're not nervous and distracted by the fact that you have not prepared well enough for this interview. I see people relax a lot more when they feel prepared, and their natural personality comes out more easily. Of course, everybody's different. People who tend to be more introverted or even on the spectrum, it's a lot harder to improvise and show your personality sort of on the fly in an interview when you're under pressure. So I think in those cases, even more important to prepare. And one of the things that you can do if you know that it's something that you shy away from, or you're not quite sure how to bring your personality out, is thinking about how to bake that in. Like, let's say, tell me about yourself, or why am I interested in this role? What's an interesting detail about myself that I could share here that gives a little bit of a sense of who I am, right? Like, I've been passionate about math since I was a kid, and that's what led me into programming. And even now, in my spare time, I solve math challenge, whatever, right? Just, riffing a little bit, but being able to share some of your hobbies or maybe formative experiences or people who are big influences for you, as you talk about some of these common questions that you're pretty sure they're going to ask. They're definitely going to ask why you're interested in the role, and about some of the different experiences in your past. So yeah, and being prepared for small talk and some of those silly questions about what animal you would be if you could be any animal.
Thank you. So I do want to be respectful of your time and everyone else's time. Any last nuggets or pieces of advice that you'd like to share before I wrap it up for today?
I think you're able to cover most of, I guess the one thing I would say is that I do highly recommend, the reason I picked the things that I covered in today's webinar is because I really do think these are topics to prepare for. So if you are getting out there to start interviewing, take the time to outline those bullet points for the tell me about yourself. Any time you spend on that tell me about yourself, it's going to pay off because it's going to make you more comfortable, more confident. It's going to help you start the interview strong, right? Creating those greatest hit stories, behavioral stories, and having a collection of those ready, getting comfortable talking about strengths and weaknesses. Some of the things I didn't have time to cover today, but always being prepared. I did touch on it a little bit, always being prepared for that question about why you're interested in this role, why you're interested in your particular career path, and being able to articulate that well, being able to outline some of those answers and practice. I know I keep saying practice, but practice really, really does help a lot. And you do have access to Big Interview. We have a lot of content on specific situations. I mentioned the military playbook. We also have a playbook for folks where English is not their first language. We have a playbook for people who are making a career change. We have a playbook for people who are introverts, and struggle with selling themselves. So we have a lot of content on there that might address any other challenges you might be dealing with right now.
Yes, huge proponent of Big Interview. I've used it myself. I tell my students to use it all the time. It's great practice. So please, I just put in the link in our chat if you'd like to access Big Interview. Our career advisors, oh, thank you. It's right there. And I just realized that was you, Pam, when I did the practice mock interviewing on Big Interview, but it was great. And then you can also make an appointment with a career advisor. We also do mock interviews with students. I know we didn't get to all those questions, but we're happy to answer those. And then just to put in a plug, I'm sure all of you are inspired today. Tomorrow, we will be having a mock interview night with USC alumni. I put that in the chat. So if you do want to practice, and I agree with Pam, it's all about practice. Alumni will be available to help you prepare and practice for interviewing through mock interviews and give you some effective feedback. So we have a lot of ways to support you. This will be recorded. I know there are a lot of questions, so we will post that on our YouTube channel for the Career Center. But I truly want to thank you, Pam, for being here this afternoon. Lots of great information that I know our students really learned from. I learned a lot as well, but we really appreciate your time this afternoon.
And I just want to mention, for those of you who have questions that I didn't get to, I'm happy to answer questions on LinkedIn as well. If you're on LinkedIn, you want to come find me and send a question, I'm happy to address questions that people have. So yeah, great to be here with all of you. Thanks so much, Stephanie, for inviting me to participate.
Thank you, Pam. Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining.